friends, and welcome to the Creative Cast. I am your host, Tammy Munson. Now, if you are new and listening to this podcast for the first time, I just want to welcome you. I'm so glad that you are here. Again, this is only episode 2, so probably the majority of you are new. So if you want to hear the who, the how, the why, go back and listen to the trailer. And I go into all that stuff, how I decided why to do a podcast of my own after all this time, and kind of what the podcast is all about. Today, I'm super excited. I'm going to be talking about how to choose a name for your podcast. If you're in the launch phase of your podcast, this is obviously something that you need to give some thought to. And before we kind of get into the specifics of that, and before you kind of start brainstorming a name for your podcast, I want you to think about the 4 main categories that most podcast names fit into. And I find that most podcast names fit into one of these 4 buckets. The first one is my favorite. Keep it simple. We'll refer to as KISS, the KISS method. Sometimes being simple and direct is the best way to go. You name your show exactly what it is, so your listeners identify it immediately and never doubt what it's about. So 2 podcasts that immediately come to mind, the Storytellers Live podcast, as well as the Chemo Chair Prayers podcast. Now, these are great examples of simple podcast names that get right to the point. It's just that simple. And it's a perfect name. The thing about the simple podcast names is they also perform better in searches because they use keywords that a potential listener would look for. By quickly and effectively describing your show's tone, content, personality is the most important factor to consider when naming your podcast. It's not a time to be ambiguous or unnecessarily crafty. It's not a time to necessarily be cutesy. You want to stay relevant to the topic and skip the names that require additional explanation to get your point across. Now, a word of caution about this. There was a study not too long ago that analyzed over 650,000 show titles, and they found 75% of all podcast names were 29 characters or less. Now, technically, you have 225 characters to play with when naming your podcast, but you want to focus on the shorter names for the biggest impact. The second bucket is a play on words. Now, some podcasts use common phrases, puns in their podcast name. Now, these can help make a statement and stand out from the crowd when a potential listener is scrolling past hundreds of shows. There's so many different examples, but the one that comes to mind for me is a podcast called The Moth. Now, I'm sure you're thinking, well, that must be a show about insects. No, actually, it's not. Their show is all about promoting the art and the craft of storytelling and to honor and celebrate the commonality and diversity of the human experience. Now, while a clever podcast name could catch someone's eye, you kind of have to be careful here. There's a chance that listeners won't understand an abstract name, or they'll think, like in the case of The Moth, that it's a show about insects. That's not going to be a topic that they're interested in. They're automatically going to make that assumption. This could immediately dismiss your show, even if the clever name doesn't relate to your topic at all. An easy way to test out your name is tell a friend about it and ask them if they know what it's about. If they can't even guess your topic, even if they see your cover art, you may want to opt for something a little more descriptive. So if you already have a following and you're going to be starting a podcast and all that kind of stuff, give your audience a couple of options and see what resonates with them, because they're most likely going to be your listenership as well. So another idea to think about is to incorporate your brand name or your actual name. Now, if you or your brand already has an audience before you start a podcast, it's often easiest to use the same name because this is going to help people associate your new podcast with your existing brand. one reason is why I went with the Creative Cast. My business name is Tammy Munson Creative, so it's the Creative Cast. Simple, easy. Another common thing that people are opt to do, especially if they have a large following, is to use their name. Like Allie Worthington, the name of her podcast is just simply the Allie Worthington Show. When you use your name like that and you have that following, you're going to leverage the popularity of that. Now, the name doesn't really tell you much about the podcast, but if you generally like their stuff, you're probably going to like their podcast as well. And like I said, that's one reason why I went with Creative Cast instead of Tammy Munson Creative. Because if I add on to that, if I add multimedia or marketing services, which is one of the future plans to my business, or if I even sell it, the podcast can still live on. If I decide to move into a different area, the podcast can still live on. So if you want to include your personal name, go for it. You just kind of have to be a little clever here because Apple Podcasts reject names that just are tacked on to the end. For example, like Creative Cast with Tammy Munson. So your name has to be part of the show, kind of like Allie does, or the Tim Ferriss Show, or the Gary Vee Experience, or something of that nature. Now, the fourth bucket is you want to make sure that you're conveying the tone. So an effective way to create a unique podcast is to build your personality right into the podcast name. Use descriptive words, punctuation to convey the right tone to potential listeners. So a really great example of this is the podcast that Barbara Corcoran hosts called 888 Barbara. Now, on her show, she answers life, relationship, and business questions. And her podcast name simply refers to the phone number that you can call to ask your question. It's really a very clever way to include her personality and promote her own show at the same time. Now, a couple of things you're going to want to consider is what is the searchability of that? So podcasts are part of the greater digital media world. So how easily your show can be found via keyword searches really affects the growth of the audience of that podcast. And the searchability basically refers to its SEO value and whether or not it's going to show up as a result of a user's search. Now, many podcast directories refer to a podcast title and author fields when deciding if your podcast was related to a user search. That's just naturally part of their algorithm. So in order to increase that likelihood of your show appearing in those results, you want to consider including the keywords potential listeners will use. Another thing is think about the word of mouth discovery. So how many times has this happened? A friend suggests a new podcast to you that you absolutely have to listen to. Now, word of mouth recommendations are a big part of organically growing your audience, but think about how your listeners will talk about your show to their networks, to their audiences, to their friends. Think about the name, if it's difficult to spell, uses common abbreviations, things like that. So if you have a show, let's say it's How to Lose 15 Pounds. I'm not saying there's a show like that, but let's just use that for an example. Okay, so you say, oh, you got to listen to the show. It's really great. It's all about her weight loss journey. Did she say 15 pounds? Did she say 50 pounds? When I type it in, is it pounds spelled out? Is it the abbreviation? What is it? So you want to try and make it as easy as possible for them to find. As you consider, because you don't want to miss out on engaging new listeners just because they weren't sure how to spell the title of your show. The other thing is, say your podcast name out loud. Now, have you ever said a phrase so many times in a row that by the end, every word starts to sound like gibberish? Your podcast name will become one of those phrases. I guarantee it. Because you'll say it over and over and over again with each and every show. So think of each episode's introduction, the calls to action, how often you're going to plug the podcast in day-to-day conversation. You're probably going to end up saying your show's name a couple thousand times. So as you narrow down your list of options, I want you to say it out loud. Say it over and over and over again and throw out any versions you don't consistently, clearly deliver. Avoid stumbling phrases that are hard to say off the cuff, ones that don't flow naturally for you, that are just difficult for others to repeat. The other thing I want you to think about is to get some feedback. So once you've settled on maybe 3 or 4 options, I want you to start asking for feedback from your network. Talk to friends and family and coworkers for their first impressions and reactions. It's easy to miss glaring issues because you already know what you're trying to convey. By assessing their honest opinions, hopefully, they're giving you their honest opinion about it, you're going to gain some critical feedback on whether or not you're going to go with option A versus option B. Now, having launched numerous podcasts over the years, I've noticed a few key mistakes that people tend to make. One of the first things is they don't check the availability of that podcast. Like I said, you want it to be easy as possible for listeners to find your show because it's crucial to the growth of your audience. Now, as you brainstorm a list of podcast name options, make sure that you do your homework to ensure that the domain is available and all the social media handles are available as well. If you're going to promote your podcast on Instagram and Pinterest, your Facebook page or a Facebook group, you're going to be doing stuff on TikTok, wherever you're going to be, you want to make sure that those handles are available. Now, the other thing I've noticed is people utilizing overly long or keyword stuff titles. Now, I know it's tempting, so tempting, to maximize your discoverability by filling your title with lots and lots of keywords. But I could tell you, Apple Podcasts does not like this. And if you're trying to launch a podcast, you have to be approved by Apple Podcasts. Now, you could use just Spotify or just Stitcher or different podcast directories like that. But most of the requirements based on podcast names, it kind of follows what Apple is doing. Whether you agree with it or whether you don't, that's just kind of the way it is. By adding extra terms to try and game the system a little bit, it's not going to do you any favors. In fact, it's probably going to work against you because Apple Podcasts is very strict when it comes to this kind of things, and they can reject your initial submission. So let's say you already have a podcast and you try and name it something differently and you try and keyword stuff things into there, they will automatically remove you if they suspect any kind of foul play, kind of gaming the system. So just don't do it. Just stay away from it. One of the main questions I get when it comes to podcast titles is, Tammy, I have thought and can't come up with something that's suitable. A lot of times I find inspiration by using one of those podcast name generators. Now, I'm not saying that you have to use that. I mean, if you find one that you like, great, use it. As long as it's available, as long as the URL is available and all the social media handles are available, and you don't have to pay some ungodly amount of money in order to secure that. But I like to use it as inspiration. And I've suggested this to clients on more than one occasion, and that's kind of how they got the inspiration. You know, you could put in a lot of different keywords, and the generator will literally spit out hundreds of ideas. And you may come across one and go, I like that, but what if I inserted this word for that word or something to that effect? And like I said, you may get lucky and find the perfect name through there. But at the very least, it's going to give you some inspiration of maybe where to start. Now, one of the other things that I get is, what should I do if my podcast name is already taken? I get it. You've chosen the perfect name. You've spent time and research and all this kind of stuff, and you realize it's already taken by another podcast. In my opinion, it's time to go back to the drawing board, even if the other show doesn't appear to be too popular. And I say this because you want to avoid unnecessary marketing confusion and also, and maybe even more importantly, sidestep potential legal hassles in order to set yourself up for some long-term success. Because like I've talked about on other episodes, podcasting is a long-term game. And your name needs to be unique to your show. And y'all, using the same name as another show is just not a good idea. And I've seen a number of shows where they literally have the same name. Even though their topics are a little bit different as far as the content of what exactly they're talking about, they're still exactly the same. Or they may flip one word for another word. It's still pretty close. So I would always go back to the drawing board and see if you can come up with something a little bit better. Maybe look at your other options that you had. So if you want to continue with that name, your first step is to contact that show's host and see if the show is still active. If they're no longer producing episodes due to pod fade, they may be willing to remove their podcast so you can use the name. Sometimes they may even want to sell it to you. Now, if you can't get the preferred name, and your next step is to swap out keywords with synonyms, sometimes that can work. For example, if you want to change expert to guru, or money to finance, or motherhood to parenting, you get the idea. So as you can see, there's a lot to consider when you choose a podcast name. So if you are in this stage of the game, go ahead and brainstorm that list of names and see what's the best fit for you and your show. Because after all the people that need to like it, you have to love it. You have to look at it and you have to say it more than anyone else out there. And because I know this is also a common question, if in the future you decide you don't like your name, you want to change it up a bit, it's just not really meeting the needs of what you want to do, there's always ways to tweak that without straying too far from its original form. So I don't want you to spend so much time on your podcast name that you never launch your show. Because like I say all the time, being ready is a lie. Okay, so don't fall into the analysis paralysis trap of going, well, I just don't know. But do some of the homework to make sure that you've got the best option for you. Thank you so much for tuning into the show. If you are a seasoned podcaster or have been doing it for a little bit, you already have a name for your show, I would love to hear how you came up with the name for your show. So go ahead and email me at Tammy, Tammy, at TammyMunsonCreative.com and let me know. And because I'm going to include all of this on a future episode. So again, thank you so much for tuning into the show. Please go over to the Creative Cast over on Apple Podcasts. And I would be so honored if you would subscribe, rate, and review the show because, again, that's how other people find out about the show. Now, next week, one of my favorite topics, how to be a great podcast guest. Because that's just important as being a host. So I'm going to be talking all about that, as well as my take on having guests pay to be on your show, so pay to play, as well as having them sign a contract. These are two of the things that a lot of people are talking about right now. And so I have some very probably unique ways that I look at it. I'm so happy to be on this journey with each and every one of you. I'm so glad that you're here tuning in. Above all, remember this. You're worthy of so much in this life. And I want you to be living your best life. You can do this. I believe in you. So everyone have a wonderful week. And I will talk to you then.